Just by way of introduction, I'm Craig. I'm Council's Regulatory Manager. My role in all this involves coordinating the regulatory response. In other words, I'm pretty much the pointy end of things. This is Dave Brunston over here. Yep. Basically, he's Council's engineering advisor. He's really experienced in seismic assessment, and he's been involved with MB, who are the ones that create these rules and regulations, and implementing the rollout of these sort of regulations. So he's helped MB with that, and he's also been assisting other councils like Tararua, grappling with this sort of issue. Russell Palmer, who some of you might know, is unwell tonight. He's sort of team leader for building services, so he wanted to be here, but we've got Bob Dunn, our senior building officer. So we've got some bit of technical expertise in the room, not counting myself. And basically, Bob and Russell are the ones that make the decisions around building. So they're sort of council's decision makers in this sort of space. Peter, where are you? Thank you. Yep. So Peter Wimsett is council's strategy manager. So his role in all this is really around the economic development response. Again, I just acknowledge Councillor Kerry Sutherland in the room. Thanks for joining us, Kerry. In terms of housekeeping, sure most of you know, bathroom's just in the back, and if I will run screaming out in the car park and follow me, I'll be the first out. And basically, if you put your mobile phones on silent during the presentation, that'd be really cool. Appreciate that. I thank most of you for coming in the door, but thank you again for giving the time to us. It's an important issue for the public and for building owners. Acknowledge that as well. And without further ado, we'll probably get on to it. But just before we do, if I could just get a show of how many sort of building owners are in the room, and just give us a bit of a commercial building owners, I should say. Cool. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Just gives us a bit of a feel for who we're presenting to. So thank you. Without further ado, we'll crack on with this presentation. So just jumping over this overview, we'll talk about the purpose of the consultation in this meeting, the background to earthquake-prone buildings and the legislation, the process that we have to follow for identifying priority buildings and thoroughfares, key consultation questions, so that booklet that, the big booklet that I've probably foisted on a few of you, so the questions in there, and then looking ahead, assistance basically, and then your questions. So if I could ask you to hold your questions to the end, appreciate that as well, and we'll do our best to answer them. So basically the purpose of this consultation is seeking the views of the community on which thoroughfares, so we're talking about busy roads and footpaths, which warrant requiring building owners to speed up, or using the term prioritise, the remediation of unreinforced masonry buildings. So again, this is probably getting a bit repetitive, but we'll provide you with the background to how this sort of came about, and the process, and basically the section of the town centre that council staff have identified as proposed to be a designated thoroughfare, and how we did that. And encourage you to please make submissions. I'll repeat that a few times. Please make a submission to us. So in terms of background, we've actually had a system for managing and identifying earthquake-prone buildings since about 30 odd years ago in the 91 Building Act. And what that looked like was every council had their own local policy around how they manage and identify those buildings. Small councils like Tararua, these small rural councils, take a passive approach, and what the end result of that is that we don't have any buildings confirmed as earthquake prone, but some have been assessed as having low ratings. And just to give you context to that, so like Mother's Day earthquake, that type of thing, where council had back in the day engineers engaged to go and assess buildings. So there's background information from those engineers, but no buildings went through the process of being confirmed prone. We've got Christchurch behind me. I think most of you will know what happened there in terms of loss of life and what happened there, so without dwelling on that too much. Basically, the government of the day, their key focus was improving public safety, preventing the loss of further life from collapsing buildings. And so this sort of ended up with a change to the Building Act, basically requiring councils to actively identify and have buildings remediated. So that's quite a change for a district like Tararua or some of those other districts that had those passive policies. This word in here that I've lifted from MB, it's MB's words. The new system is trying to seek a balance between risk and safety, costs and protection of heritage buildings. And also getting to the point of today is really wanting to speed up the remediation of certain buildings. Pass over to Dave now and he can take you through the rest. I'll pop back in a bit.
Thanks, Craig, and good evening, everyone. It's very pleased to be able to help Tararua District Council and its community with the challenging question of how to deal with the older buildings, the older building stock, and we'll work through a few more, just telling the story why we're doing this, but just starting off with this slide, which to cut somewhat to the chase sets the time frames for what the Building Act amendments that came through in 2016 following the Canterbury earthquakes, what it means. But basically, there's no singular time frame for which buildings have to be addressed. The process follows a journey of the council identifying potentially earthquake-prone buildings and then issuing letters to the owners, which gives them 12 months to obtain engineering assessments, and then the process of determining whether or not the buildings are actually earthquake-prone follows. And so it all depends on what plays out next year when council issues letters to buildings, to owners of buildings that are potentially earthquake prone. That will set the timeframes to follow. But as in terms of, there are two categories of buildings, if you like, and as Craig has alluded to, the subject of the consultation currently underway, and mainly tonight's session, is that owners of unreinforced masonry buildings on the so-called priority thoroughfares have half the time to have them strengthened versus the default time frame of 15 years for owners of other earthquake-prone buildings. But we'll talk through all of the dimensions of that, starting with what does an earthquake-prone building or an EPB mean, and the two components to that. Firstly, the engineering assessment and determining whether it is less than 34% of new building standard, and the supplementary step is then Russell and Bob and the council team, if you like, confirming that there is actually a life safety risk, and then that results in the building being determined to be earthquake prone. Just to paint a slightly broader scene, and this is what was brought through at the time of the 2016 amendments, aimed at the councils that hadn't actually progressed their identification. MB created three profile categories, which were categories within which a reasonable proportion of the buildings are likely to be found to be earthquake prone. And the three categories are, perhaps obviously, the first profile, category A, is unreinforced masonry buildings. The second profile, category B, is the multi-storey buildings constructed prior to 1976, when concrete buildings in particular didn't have anywhere near the amount of reinforcement that more modern buildings do. And also for areas such as Tararua in high and medium seismic hazard areas, they also picked out the very early concrete buildings prior to 1935, because again, 1935 was when the first national seismic design standard came out, 4 years after the Hawke's Bay earthquake. And so, again, they're stronger in nature than unreinforced masonry buildings, but they were deemed worthy of needing to have the engineering assessment. I should also mention that for the purposes of Profile Category A, that includes strengthened and as well as unstrengthened buildings, because, harking back to the point that Craig made, people have been aware of the problem with brick buildings for quite some time. There's a lot of early strengthening went on, but it was usually done to quite a low level of earthquake load, and it involved some very basic technology, such as putting steel straps in places. And we knew before the Christchurch earthquake, as engineers, that really wasn't what was required to properly keep bricks in buildings. Then we segue into priority buildings, and basically this as a consequence of these fatalities that occurred, the 39 fatalities that occurred in the Christchurch earthquake due to falling masonry, but equally MB painted a wider picture, because they wanted to pick up buildings with certain occupancy, such as schools and hospitals and emergency services facilities, to get that early priority as well. Then it comes back to the subject of the current consultation of unreinforced masonry facades above busy roads and footpaths, hence the term thoroughfares. Just going back a slight step and just articulating what an unreinforced masonry building is in terms of the legislation and regulations. We all sort of know what that is, but it's basically the definition is to pick up buildings that are essentially substantially of unreinforced masonry building. That could be brick or block or stone, without reinforcement from concrete beams and columns. And hence the image on the screen of an archetypal early building with a parapet within the facade, and sometimes some ornamentation. And again, what is well established is that the whole restraint of those heavy facades back into the building, which is where the failure point occurs. The point of this slide is also to highlight there's a whole lot of other buildings around our towns that have masonry in them, and particularly where they can have beams and columns, particularly the side walls where they put the bricks in to achieve a firewall situation. And so that's what we call infill masonry. And so we have a building which has reasonable concrete elements, but brickwork as well, that is not an unreinforced masonry building.
Dave, you can point one out across the road called the Carnegie Building. And when people leave, that's really a significant risk building.
I was looking at one even closer when we walked down the alleyway to get to here, Peter. So, but again, just to recap, another dimension of the thoroughfares is the vehicular aspect, and this is still one of the many sad images from the Christchurch earthquake, where there are 8 people in this bus that perished. I've had the privilege of working with the one survivor from that bus, and it's a lady who made a very impassioned plea to the legislators when they brought through the amendments, and a bit of the priority building rules that we now have were due to her impassioned plea to the select committee. The real tragedy of this was that the Christchurch earthquake occurred on essentially the 80th anniversary of the Hawke's Bay earthquake, in which 256 people perished, many of those under unreinforced masonry. and we're still dealing with the problem. And that again is another reason why government really stepped in and ramped up the priority in this space. We all know equally that Christchurch was a very powerful earthquake directly beneath the city in February 2011. But these are just some images from the first earthquake that we just recently marked, the 10th anniversary of the Dannevirke earthquake that occurred in September 2010. And that also resulted in a lot of masonry ending up in the streets. The fact that that happened at 4:30 in the morning led to the fact that no lives were lost in that masonry if that earthquake itself had occurred at the same lunchtime as the February event. Then there would most certainly been actually more lives lost due to masonry than was the case in the February 2011 earthquake. The point being, these are the sorts of earthquakes that do happen around New Zealand every decade. So getting back to the new regime and what the Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Act required council to do. It requires all councils to identify parts of public roads, footpaths or other thoroughfares, to use that full expression, firstly onto which parts of unreinforced masonry buildings could fall, and secondly with sufficient vehicular or pedestrian traffic to warrant prioritisation. The intent is clear, but equally there were no specific definitions or thresholds of in terms of the sufficient vehicular or pedestrian traffic. And part of the reason for that is it's a different perception between one of the cities and one of these smaller towns, but it's something that the team has worked through to try and just figure out where things sit for this council across the 4 towns. And so the process of gathering the information was doing a visual survey just to form a view on where the ORAM buildings are in the 4 towns, in the main centres, researching the files to try and understand which of them are actually unreinforced masonry or reasonably likely to be. Then thinking through that whole busy traffic and pedestrian thoroughfare question. And the last step in the process is this one, where the community's input is being sought. MB produced a guideline document to help councils through this process, and just to show a couple of the tables from that, and it's a long way back to the screen, but you can see from the headings the sort of examples, and down the left-hand column talks about areas relating to social activities or work. The main things, and again the far right-hand column gives examples of how that might be applied to small towns and rural areas. If we look at the one relevant entry, most relevant entry in this table, it says areas such as the shopping area on the main street, the local pub or the community centre. That's, if you like, from the pedestrian perspective. Then we look at the key traffic routes, the counterpart table for that. And again, well-trafficked main streets or sections of state highways and arterial routes. And of course, the common denominator through the district, through the 4 towns, is essentially State Highway 2. And that's formed a large part of the basis for what has been worked through. So for Dannevirke, the proposed priority thoroughfare areas, as shown in the consultation document and on the map on the screen, really encompasses those areas. And again, this is not all about individual buildings. That's not the subject of the consultation or of tonight. But just to sort of summarise the information on which that area is proposed, is that we believe there's approximately 30 unreinforced masonry buildings within these streets, both the high street and the side streets. 21 of those, about 2/3 of them are on High Street. And so these are the ones that, if upon the engineering assessment they are confirmed to have unreinforced masonry facades and rating less than 34%, they'll be required to be strengthened within 7.5 years. There's also within the CBD area another 9 early concrete buildings, that profile category C that I showed you before, that again will be receiving letters from the council requesting an engineering assessment within 12 months, and if they are confirmed to be less than 34%, they'll have that default time frame of 15 years to strengthen them. One of the considerations here, to come back to the having flagged the state highway as a clear priority thoroughfare in itself. One of the questions is what's the level of risk on the side streets, and the vehicle count down High Street is the order of more than 8,500 vehicles per day, and still half of that in Miller Street at the western end of town. The intermediate streets have a lesser vehicle count, and you have the other consideration that Broad Street has a fairly high number of people, pedestrians, going to and from the supermarket. So that's just a snapshot of some of the considerations that have gone into proposing that area for designated as the priority thoroughfares. So the questions that are asked within the consultation process and within the document are threefold. There's firstly, obviously, do you agree with the thoroughfares identified? Part of that is if you're not in full agreement, which are the particular parts of the designated thoroughfares that you disagree with and why? But also, are there other thoroughfares that meet the criteria but are not listed? This is a really careful consideration of public safety that needs to be brought through.
Dave, is it worth mentioning that those questions are set by central government that we have to ask? They're not specific questions we've come up with ourselves.
Good point, thank you. And this is the process that all councils that in the high and medium seismic hazard areas are going through, and they are both obvious and standard questions, if you like. The consultation process that's currently underway, we're in the midst of the 6-week period that closes Friday the 16th of October, and we're midway through the public information meetings, and following the review and of the receipt of the submissions, there'll be a public hearing, so people are asked to indicate if they make a submission, if they'd like to be heard, and that feeds in after analysis to a report to council, from which in early December a decision will be made on the proposed thoroughfares in each of Eketahuna, Pahiatua, Woodville and Dannevirke. Again, just to paint the slightly wider picture of how this plays out, and following the decision that council makes on those areas, the process of the council issuing letters to owners of potentially earthquake-prone buildings will kick off. And as I alluded to when I stepped up, that will play out over time. But there will be that initial focus on URM buildings, on priority thoroughfares. And again, the owners have 12 months from the date they receive these letters to obtain and submit engineering assessments. And part of the desire is not to overload the engineering resource, means that those letters will be sent out through next year and not all necessarily at once. And the work reverts to to Russell and Bob and the team to review the engineering assessments they get, and there are criteria in the MB's EPB methodology for that, running the eye over them for their acceptability. And again, we're warranted. An earthquake-prone building decision we made on a building-by-building basis. The notice is issued, and those timeframes will kick in. And again, just emphasising the default timeframe is 15 years, and these priority buildings have half that. Touched upon the process of the challenges of obtaining timely engineering assessments. The engineering profession is fairly busy on a number of fronts, including there's still a lot of assessments being done nationally, and so council is very mindful of that, and as well as not sending out all the notices at one time that could overload that particular pipeline. It's actually trying to do some facilitation of appropriate engineers that are available, willing, and experienced in undertaking seismic assessments, and briefing them on what this is all about, and making their contact details available to building owners. Again, just to it's a bit of a support mechanism that is being planned, and again, the ability to have an ongoing dialogue with engineers that are working in the town while they're doing it, just to be able to monitor their progress, and again, how they're working with the owners is just an additional bit of facilitation that council is proposing. The second theme of facilitation relates to potential sources of funding assistance. Peter.
Thank you. So I think you're probably picking up that this has been a long time coming to manage it through, and the key being that instead of having 15 years, we might only have 7.5 years if the buildings are deemed to meet the criteria. So that's about this consultation, but it's also about making you aware of the safety issue. You've got to think about the tenants and yourselves if you're using your buildings, and the risk that you're taking by having buildings that could be earthquake prone. So there's a good, valid public safety reason that we have to be doing this. I note that Mayor Tracy Collis has popped into the back there, so I'm sure that she can answer questions as well. She's been attending these things. In terms of from the outset, our Chief Executive, Blair King, was at the Christchurch earthquake in his USAR role, Urban Search and Rescue. He saw firsthand the buildings in the collapsed state as the earthquake continued to have aftershocks in terms of pulling people out from being trapped during the Christchurch earthquake. Eventually he ended up working in Wellington, trying to come up with some of these rules, trying to make them more practical. And we as a council are now close to the end point of having to do this review, because we have been watching what other local authorities have been doing, and the progression really of how the country has been responding, both cities and rural councils, in terms of the impact on their communities. Because clearly 1931 earthquake had a big effect on the Tararua in particular. We had then the 1934 earthquake, which hit Pahiatua, which was still to this day, I think, number 20 in the all-time list of earthquakes of European settlement. And that's meant that a whole lot of buildings have, that's the Art Deco style, but it also means that they're brick, which gives us a few challenges. We've had subsequent earthquakes, which meant that work has taken place on those buildings to help strengthen. So it's not a clear case. That's why we have to go in and understand the situation. So hence, in terms of our council response, we want to make sure that those engineering assessments are done efficiently with qualified engineers that we know that will do the job if we possibly can. So there's a big conversation that we've got around particularly the instance where you might have a multiple tenanted property, which is essentially one structure, one building, but each part of that structure needs to be assessed under the rules. And it makes sense economically if that can be done in a combined fashion. So if we can help coordinate that and make it easier, then that's probably an efficient way to do it. If then your building is considered to be a classic architectural building, it might meet some level of government and Lotteries Commission funding. So there are some sources of funding, but it's a limited fund and it's not going to pay for everything. And your building may not meet the criteria for that funding. So there are quite a few hoops to jump through before you get some financial assistance from this. Then if your building is deemed, say you apply for a heritage status around your building, then you want to affect the repairs on your building, you might have to actually then meet the heritage requirements. So you might have just put an anchor around your neck in terms of that process, which if they're paying for it, great. If they're not, then it's not helpful, or it might make the process take even longer. The point being that we've got 7.5 years to affect the change once I think 12 months is up and the assessment has been done. So that's the key part of the consultation. The other is it a thoroughfare? Because if it's on a thoroughfare and at risk, then it's clearly going to not have 15 years to be fixed. It's only got half that time, 7.5 years. So you immediately reduce the amount of time that you can fix them. The council, we have properties that are earthquake prone.
Potentially earthquake.
Potentially. Where we've got assessments and we're going to be likely slapping up the warnings on our buildings before anyone else, just so you know. But we've been investigating this for a long time, and that's given us a good insight into the process. And shortly we'll have the plans hopefully approved for Pahiatua service centre upgrade. And we have jumped through all the hoops regarding heritage status, because that is a Heritage 2 building down in Pahiatua. So there are quite a few things that we have to worry about. We as a council have to worry about it too, and we'll hopefully lead the way. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so just to wrap up, just reinforce that we're taking submissions, we'll take them by paper, we'll take them electronically. Encourage you, please let us know what you think about those thoroughfares. And if there's anyone here tonight, not here tonight I should say, that you think, oh look, they might have been interested in this, we'll have a copy of the presentation, Mitchell is on the back. We'll have that online, and also encourage them to read this information. It's all here on the council website in form of view. Lastly, thank you very much for coming. I mean, you're taking time out of your lives, and it is an important issue, not just for building owners' economics, but public safety, as we're talking to. So, and thank you very much again for coming. Appreciate it.